Hello there. Today we are going to be debating a topic in architecture called brutalism. So, firstly, we're going to give an introduction on what brutalism itself is. So, brutalism is an architectural style that was made in the United Kingdom post World War II in around the 1950s. Le Corbusier pushed the term relating the French words béton and brut, which of course doesn't come from the English term brutal. That's a modern association. It was Peter and Alison Smithson, who were architects, that later coined the term.
The philosophy behind brutalism focuses on functionality over form, displaying the raw materials used in the building. The rejection of any ornaments is a key aspect of brutalism itself. The thesis of which we will base our argument upon is brutalism is an immoral form of architecture. I'm Justin, and I will be doing the affirmative side.
And I'm Giuliano, I will be on the opposing side. Now let's begin.
Brutalist design is extremely fragile. The biggest deterrent of brutalism is water. Since brutalism is primarily just concrete without any materials, it's easy for buildings to stay, and they don't really last that long. The walls can appear greasy, and over time they can degrade the look of the building. The brutalism, the word itself, can be taken from the word béton brut, which means raw concrete. Some brutalist buildings do incorporate different materials into the concrete to make it more sturdy, but it shows that brutalism in itself cannot exist, and it will just slowly degrade over time. Extreme temperature can crack the concrete, and it's just harder to maintain. Brutalism pushes the idea of expressing the essence of material, but this style can harm people. If it's not properly maintained, it can wither and be unsuitable to live in the building. Many brutalist buildings are often demolished for this kind of thing, like the Brutalist Welcome building, because it was difficult to upkeep it, and many of the residents suffered living conditions that were pretty ghastly, and because of that, they lost a lot of their just well-being. The fascination of expressing the raw materials of a building in an honest way is respectable, but it's just not realistic, and constantly avoiding the structural issues of brutalism is immoral, since time has shown that it has become dangerous with the Brutalist Welcome buildings, and it would just be better to abolish the style and create something similar to brutalism. Brutalism was used by the Soviet Union, and since brutalism represents imposing power and political confidence, brutalism was used for many of the buildings in the Soviet Union, and the simplicity and effect that brutalism had, many communist regimes used brutalism. Brutalism is characterized through the honesty of the buildings, preferring function over form. Brutalism came to the Soviet Union during the 1970s, where the style was used in many buildings during the time, such as the Bank of Georgia and the Palace of Consorts of Sports. Many of these brutalist buildings were popular and pushed brutalist design into their buildings, so much that brutalism has become synonymous with the Soviet Union. Brutalism is related to the needs of the Soviet Union at the time, where function was more important over form. The materials that were used in brutalism shows proletarian values, with the raw materials symbolizing labor done by the lower class. Brutalism was chosen by the Soviet Union because they were connected with the same values. The history of art does not change the meaning of the art, but when the history of the style is connected to the art, the events that happen in history can affect art. The Soviet Union was a corrupt country, and during the time of Stalin, where brutalism was most popular, many people suffered. Brutalism has values that society is deemed immoral because it has ties to the Soviet Union culture.
Okay, that's very nice. So, when I talk about brutalism, I am talking about, it does of course take in concrete, of course, but concrete itself, especially the current style of concrete that's used, and especially the style of concrete that's used in the 1950s in the Eastern Bloc, that's not inherent to brutalism. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. Brutalism and the concrete used in it, especially in the West, has very good structural stability. Water damage isn't that much of a problem. This is, again, mostly a thing in the Eastern Bloc, such as when they built it in Yugoslavia, in the Soviet Union, etc. It depends on how the concrete is made, of course. If we go back to the times of the Roman Empire, for example, that concrete that they made there, that's still lasting today. And that concrete there is also self-healing, technically. Of course, calling self-healing is gives a bit of misconceptions, but it reforms over time slowly. That's just a signifier of its durability. So we can make concrete that is much more high quality than what was used in the Eastern Bloc in the 20th century, and we do that in the modern day and in the West. So, for example, brutalism wasn't even started in the East. It was started in the United Kingdom. It's also very popular in the Eastern U.S. and also Canada as well. This is where brutalism was done very good because the concrete that was used is a very high quality. We can see that in modern brutalist buildings in Canada today that still have lasted over decades and are still good quality, and especially over time as we get better at making good quality concrete, since specific materials get cheaper over time. The materials used in brutalism have traditionally in the Eastern Bloc been done poorly, but that's because those governments didn't have that much money, especially not compared to the West. We see in the West, they're done much better. Now to aesthetics. A lot of people think of them as oppressive and gray and depressing, especially those, again, in the Eastern Bloc, such as the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and even modern countries like North Korea. But that is because of the way it was built there. When I think of brutalism, I think of architecture itself and what architecture actually means. So architecture isn't just blind. It's not just the physical buildings that we build and that's just that. The architecture that we build represents the social values of the society that we're in. So for example, back in the medieval period, when Christianity was law, basically, it was a very religious time, the architecture reflected that. The architecture doesn't come first and then the social values come after. It is the architecture's reflection of social values, the social values we want. So if, for example, we want the most unbiased society as possible, a society which has the capacity for freedom of thought as possible, a society which has the capacity for tabula rasa as much as possible, a blank slate, we have to find an architectural style that encapsulates that the most, a most default architectural style, if you will. And I see no better style than brutalism. It doesn't really impose any ideology, although of course it's impossible to not impose any ideology because that, what I said itself, is technically an ideology, but it's less blatant, it's less in your face. So it gives you as much capacity as possible to start off with a blank slate in the society that you live in, a tabula rasa. So if we value freedom of thought and coming from a blank slate, coming to our own opinions on our own, which I think most of us would agree is good for society, unless you're like some authoritarian person or something, then I do believe we should pick the architectural style that encapsulates that the most, and I believe brutalism encapsulates that the most, because it doesn't have all these ideological ornaments that, for example, medieval Christian structures would, or Islamic structures would, or even that Soviet structures would. Although it's a lesser degree to the Soviet Union, because they used a lot of brutalism, but the ways that they implemented brutalism were often ideological. But I think that in the West, how we use brutalism isn't as ideologically blatant. And I say as ideologically blatant because, again, it's impossible to not propose any ideology in any way. There will always be some form of ideology, so we should pick the one that encapsulates it, that has the least amount of ideology. And I think brutalism is good at that.
Brutalism contains an indifference to life, that the grand meaning of the world is not. It imparts a feeling of power and exudes authority. At this point, the broad majority of the population does not like brutalist buildings, with popular opinion declining around the 2000s, with like the beginning of brutalism being the most popular. There's like a whole Twitter campaign called SOS Brutalism that aims to keep all the remaining brutalist buildings in western area from not being demolished. So they have a huge museum. They like do a huge display of all the current brutalist buildings, and they try to crowdfund in order to get no brutalist buildings will be demolished no longer. And it just goes to show how much the population does not like brutalist buildings these days. There was a survey done called Top 10 Ugliest Buildings of All Time. And the second most hated building was the J. Edgar Hoover building, which is a brutalist building. It is a government building, so it does make some sense, but it shows that at this point, a lot of people do not like brutalism, and it conveys emotions that they are not happy with. And art has an effect on mental health. With the impressions we get from art can shape our lifestyle. The salutogenic theory, founded by Aaron Alvonsky, states that life experiences help shape one's sense of coherence, so your general well-being and mental health. This theory explores that what factors affect your stress and health. It's a social theory and not really used in many medical fields, but there have been research into what environments help with this health of a person. Architecture can create supportive environments that can improve one's health. Architecture philosophy focuses on studying the effects of humanity based on their physical environment. Living in brutalist buildings, which is unpopular by the general public, can cause mental harm of the people near brutalist buildings, because according to the cell-genetic theory, because of this environment which invokes such a feeling of like nihilism and that the world is corroded in just power, that there are little dots in this in this huge universe, that they can feel discouraged, and that the mental effects of their environment can lead them to a worse mental health and a worse health. Researchers believe that one of the ways that architecture affects humans is social stress, since they say that when people live in cities, it's more likely for them to not have any social connections, which is not have any more relationships, and that is horrible to human health. There have been many studies which say that loneliness is a big reason why the current generation is so sad and mostly suicidal. And it's a big indication that brutalism was popular back in the day, but we have changed our social values, so it changed what we believe in, and we're at this point where brutalist buildings give off an aura which a lot of people don't like, and because of that, they're suffering. And buildings which are disliked by the populace can be harmful to humanity because it lessens the human experience. Things which are mainly instructive to humanity are things which I consider moral, because all immoral ideas are things like greed, sloths, pride, all these things which hamper the human experience and make people suffer. And if brutalist buildings directly make people suffer through their appearance, it would be immoral.
Brutalism itself is sometimes viewed as unpopular, especially again in the Eastern Bloc, but also sometimes brutalism everywhere. But I think that's not because of brutalism itself. It's because of the way that brutalism has been used. So I don't think what people are finding displeasurable to look at is necessarily the brutalist structure itself, but it's the fact that brutalist buildings tend to be very out of place. Because of course most cities existed long before the 1950s, when brutalism started getting popular. Most cities are hundreds of years old, even thousands of years old. So there's all of this already developed urban areas, and then like a brutalist monstrosity placed right in the middle. I don't think people really like that, because people tend to like consistency in everything, but especially in their architecture, because the architecture is where we live. That's honestly what we interact with the most in aesthetics. So if we look at, let's just look at a hypothetical city that is entirely brutalist, but it's brutalism, it's not like the cheap Soviet brutalism done in the 60s that's all falling apart now because the government was cheap and didn't have much money. I mean like properly done brutalism. And if it's a city that's entirely brutalism, I don't think people would have the same reaction, because again, what people really like is consistency, and a brutalist structure surrounded by a bunch of 19th century brick streets and like brick corner stores isn't going to look that nice. Just like if there's an entirely brutalist city and there was some 16th century stonemason house placed right in the middle, or like some ancient Greek cathedral, it wouldn't really look that nice. It would look out of place. So I think that this is the main thing that people have an issue with. And I don't even think people have an issue with brutalism that much. And for example, the list that was the top 10 ugliest structures of all time, the second one was brutalist, yes, because again, brutalism tend to be done poorly. What was the first one, right?
No.
So clearly, brutalism, there's structures uglier than brutalism. And I assume that the brutalist structures on that list were the kinds of brutalism that I was talking about earlier, where it wasn't really done properly, it was made haphazardly and cheaply because the government didn't have that much money. And that's not a problem inherent to brutalism. If they were to make classical style architectures, it would look similarly bad because it's about the money that they are willing to put into it. They just happen to be building more brutalism than classical cathedrals, so we happen to associate a bad brutalism more with brutalism itself because there's more bad brutalism because the governments that just happen to be building brutalism are very cheap. And I don't think brutalism is unaesthetic either. Because again, a lot of people love brutalism, including myself, like when done properly. And I think, of course, beauty isn't objective, but the standards that most people consider beautiful, I think true brutalism corresponds to it. Brutalism tends to be very symmetrical, but it also knows when to be unsymmetrical. Because, of course, this isn't just a thing with brutalism either. For example, churches, they are considered, like especially Roman Catholic churches, they are considered to be some of the best architecture styles ever. They are not symmetrical if you look at them from a side view, because Catholic churches and all churches tend to take the shape of a cross, where they have two exits on the side and then one exit on the front. So it looks like a cross from a bird's eye view. That isn't symmetrical, but it seems beautiful. And one complaint that a lot of people have against brutalism is that it is often unsymmetrical, which they just equate to being necessarily ugly. But that isn't the case, because nobody really sees it that way. I mean, all other beautiful types of architectural styles, especially the old ones, people find them beautiful, but none of them are really symmetrical all the time. There's very few buildings that are actually symmetrical from both angles. So I think, yeah, brutalism is, and also because it's made out of concrete, it's just easier to take on more interesting forms. And the forms that it does take on tend to be less biased, as was said in my original resolution. So, yeah.
The qualities of brutalism just makes it immoral, because even though there might be wildly better brutalist buildings, because it is very hard to make it look nice, especially with like raw concrete itself as the only material to use. It's hard, and it's really hard to make a good building. But most of this was done in like 1970s, where it was most popular, with a lot of buildings being featured during that time. And especially now in the 2000s, there's just not a lot of brutalist buildings. So there are brutalist buildings, especially in Western, because when you look at the Soviet Union, it was mostly like a cost-cutting measure, so the concrete wasn't as stable and strong. And because of that, it degraded a lot, especially with like some brutalist buildings in the Soviet Union. They have to like demolish it because it's literally killing the people who are living inside of it. But it's not the quality of the building that matters, but it's the overall impression of it, because with so many people doing brutalism during the 1970s, with the Soviet Union really putting that kind of style into their infrastructure, people associate Soviet Union with brutalism. We see that brutalism has Soviet Union values. When we see a immoral, well, I would say most people would say that the Soviet Union is immoral, right? With immoral values, we often characterize that with the styles that they implemented in their power system itself. So brutalism was simplicity. Its materials was only concrete. It was an ideal to push this idea that through expressing the essence of the material, they could push forward a aura of power and strength. And a lot of people like this, but it's not popular anymore. And because of that, the only actual buildings the only actual brutalist buildings in Western and Eastern is just buildings which have degraded for countless years, being made in the 1970s. So the only brutalist buildings that people ever look at is the ones that come from the 1970s. There's never really a new brutalist building right now because we have the materials. We're not poor anymore, especially it was just post World War II. Everyone was poor as hell. We just beat the Nazis, and with all these people coming in, no one could actually pay for all the housing. Brutalism was built on function over form, but it got outdated. Most people see brutalism as dangerous, cheap, and a part of the past that should be left alone because it was characterized just after World War II, and because of that characterization, every single known brutalist building came from that era. And because of that, most people associate brutalist buildings with the values of those eras, which were usually immoral.
Okay. Well, I think there are some claims there that are just wrong. For example, that all brutalist buildings came from the 1950s and 1970s. A lot of it did because that's where it started, got popular. There are still brutalist buildings that are being built now, and that are considered to be very beautiful by the general public. For example, the IBM headquarters in London. That is a brutalist building. Wasn't constructed that long ago, relatively. The community center in Boston as well. There are a lot of other brutalist buildings that are quite new and look good because we know how to make them better now. And there are still, of course, brutalist buildings from the past that look very good. And there's some now that are considered architectural marvels too, like in the University of San Francisco, their library there. That's one of the first images that comes up when you search up brutalism, because it's just so beautiful in an austere way. And of course, none of them are falling apart and degrading like the Soviet ones, because again, those buildings were falling apart not because of brutalism itself, but because of the Soviet Union government, which, to say the least, wasn't perfect, obviously, and did not. They were just very cheap of how they built it. As I've already said, you can do this with any architectural style. This isn't unique to brutalism. The brutalist buildings in post-Soviet countries tend to be falling apart now. Not all, some are still very durable, and some people still have pretty comfortable lives in them, but some of them are falling apart now because of the way that it was built. But in most Western countries, the surviving brutalist buildings, they're still up, and they're still considered to be beautiful. So this isn't about brutalism itself. This is about the government and the way that it's done. Obviously, I'm not saying we should just cheaply take a bunch of concrete and build a cube with a hole in it, I'm saying that we should obviously still build buildings properly. We should still build them like buildings. But that the brutalist form itself is not immoral, and it is beautiful, and it is the default, or at least it should be the default. And so building it properly, like we would build every other building, they do last very long. The concrete is much higher quality. There's not really any water damage. There's very little black mold, actually, etc. The buildings are often higher quality than other modernist types of architecture. And about the point about the values being about power and authority and authoritarianism and oppressiveness and all that, simply because it was in the Soviet Union, I don't think that's true. Again, I'm always going to go back to the example of Western and modern brutalist buildings because they don't really convey that. They do symbolize power, of course. They seem very grand and powerful and sturdy. But I wouldn't say that that itself is a bad thing. But they don't necessarily signify authoritarianism. I think they signify some kind of retrofuturism, which, especially types that were popular in the Soviet Union back in the 20th century, but they were also popular in the West too. So yeah, again, it's how the brutalist structure is built. It can and is built good. I'd say almost all modern brutalist buildings in the West are built very good. I'm not including like the glass monstrosities in a lot of downtown urban centers, because those aren't really brutalist. Although a lot of people confuse the two. But brutalism, especially modern brutalism, is very proportional, clean, sturdy, symmetrical. Not necessarily symmetrical, but symmetrical in a good way, and also unsymmetrical in a bad way. Unsymmetrical in a good way, I mean. I'll cut that out. But yeah, now we can just go to an open argument, I guess. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't matter how popular, like how modern current brutalist buildings are, because there are some very like brutalist buildings in this modern era. But for the public, the most focused brutalist buildings are the ones that were made in the 1970s, especially like the J. Hoover Edge building. Those were very widely popular, and when people see brutalism, they see those types of buildings. There are still modern brutalists.
When they see those types of brutalism, they see those types of buildings.
Yes.
But when they see a new type of brutalism, since it is different from those types of brutalism, they get a different impression because it's not the same thing.
Yeah, but it shows that in order for brutalism to succeed, they had to change the structure in some sort of way. That they had to change the concrete, that they couldn't go to the original idea, which was just like raw concrete, like bad stuff, in order to.
It's still raw concrete, it's just better concrete.
It's better concrete, but
It's not as cheap as the cheap governments like the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia did and used.
Yeah. It's not like.
It's not inherent to the idea of brutalism, right?
It is. I feel like it is inherent to the idea of brutalism, because brutalism itself is the simplicity of its materials, and the concrete itself, like the quality of the concrete itself, might not matter, but it is the values which it gives off. Like, there are really fantastic brutalist buildings out there, and the Soviet Union did not make the best brutalist buildings out there, and they are.
There's still some good Soviet brutalist buildings too. Like, a lot of people lambast the Soviet Union too much, and especially their architecture, and a lot of their buildings, especially ones not in the major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, weren't that great. But again, that's a government thing. That's not a brutalist thing. The brutalist buildings that they weren't cheap, big cheapos on, they still look great and they're still standing. Even the Soviet ones.
But it's the impression that the brutalist buildings make, because, and as I said this before, as brutalist buildings are synonymous with the Soviet Union.
Ooh, spooky.
Yes, very spooky. The values itself are disingenuous because it's an ideal. Simplicity, I believe that's what brutalism is trying to express, right? Simplicity, but it's an ideal. It doesn't actually work out in real life, because it's been proven beforehand that raw concrete degrades. Even if it's the most high quality thing, it has to be maintained in some way, of course, right? The extreme temperatures.
It's the most high quality thing, that's not true. Again, there's still concrete structures from 4,000 years ago that are alive now. Well, maybe 4,000 years is a bit too long, but from the Roman Empire.
Yeah, but they look completely different than what it used to be.
Well, it's a different style that they're using, but it's still concrete. If the Romans used the concrete that they used, they could have made brutalist structures. Of course, they didn't have that architectural style, so they didn't. But they could have made brutalist structures with that concrete and it'd still be up today. So again, brutalism is about the form of the building. The concrete that's used, like again, it is raw concrete, but you can just use a different type of concrete and have that raw concrete and it works good. Which is what is being used now in the modern West, and it works very well. Of course, like, again, there were cheap governments that used cheap concrete because they were cheapos. But the West, I'd say, is not like that, and our brutalist buildings are pretty great.
I do disagree on you on saying that it's form, because if it was form, they would have ornaments, right? Some sort of way to glamorize the brutalist buildings.
Form doesn't have to have ornaments. Form is just the proportions of the building. That's it. Form itself is literally just proportions. So yeah, brutalist structures, they don't really have ornaments. They tend to be very simple in their design, but it's still a form. That's still the form of it, even though it's a simpler form. And that's why I think it's a better form, because going back to the first argument I proposed here, it's the most unbiased form. It doesn't push ideology on you as much as like buildings that have such excessive ornamentation on it would. Going back to the concept that John Locke proposed of tabula rasa, it makes that more achievable, I'd say, because this might, and of course what I said might sound silly because it's just buildings, who cares? But the buildings that we live in, the architecture around us, that is what we live in. That's literally where we spend most of our time in. So that will give us subconscious messages. That will give us subliminal messages about social values. And I think that brutalism, not like the rundown $50 brutalism in the Soviet Union, but I think actual brutalism, which is done much better in the West, but it was still done good in the East as well, but especially in the West, I think it does have these good ideals. It doesn't necessarily look authoritarian. Some people think that Soviet brutalist structures look authoritarian because the Soviets built them in a certain way and they were in the Soviet Union and people associate the Soviet Union with authoritarianism, but I see that people don't necessarily associate brutalist structures in the West with that because it's in the West, and the West does it a certain way, and they're still brutalist.
It's the impression that brutalist buildings give off, because architecture is very important and it does help change someone's mental health. So what I'm saying is, brutalism, no matter how good it looks or how modern it seems, it is the values it holds, and I'm not gonna, oh gosh, I'm just not waiting for it back in the The impressions that brutalist buildings give off seem very negative at this point, because architecture does impact someone's mental state, and the most brutalist buildings were built into the 1970s, and there will always be fantastic brutalist buildings emerging more better, stronger, can last a longer time. But since the culture was mostly established in the 1970s, it hasn't really progressed as the years gone by, because I believe, because when you have something so simple where it's defined by its hard lines, its materials, there's nothing really to adapt from it. Because you can add different materials, you can add different shapes, or maybe different pigments, something like that. But at the end of the day, it's just concrete, just shaped in different lines. Maybe it's a cube, maybe it's 3 cubes stacked on top of each other in a cool shape. That's what brutalist is, to be simple, to be function over form.
So if it's simple, it's brutalist.
No, I'm saying function over form. I see brutalism as simplicity.
Well, brutalism, again, is itself a form. The form tries to convey the function more, but it is still a form. And I do think it has evolved. Like, if we look at old brutalist structures from the 50s and 60s, they tend to be more blocky, with like square blocky windows. If we look at modern brutalist structures, they're still pretty blocky, but they have more windows, and they also tend to almost have like a 45-degree angle going up, where it's blocks going up like this, at a 45-degree angle with windows. That's a very common, very modern brutalist type thing that didn't exist back in the day. But I don't think it necessarily has to evolve, because, and it will inevitably evolve, of course, but again, the point of brutalism that I'm trying to make is that it is the most default type of architecture, and should be the default of society. Obviously, I'm not saying it should be the only architecture in all of society. I mean, like random farming towns, I think their architecture is pretty nice, they can have that. It doesn't mean need brutalist structures literally everywhere. But in urban areas where most people live, which is the default of society, I think brutalism should be the default, because that, again, conveys the message that I proposed earlier of tabula rasa and being unbiased and being the most default. I think the mistake that a lot of people make when they think about brutalism is they think of these false ideologies that have nothing to do with brutalism. They're put onto it because of the ideology that the specific government that tended to make brutalism back in the 20th century had. But that is not what brutalism is about. That's not the ideology of brutalism. Brutalism, in its purest form, is simply being unbiased and being for the needs of the most amount of people. It allows for the most unbiased way to grow up in a society, because architecture, again, is a big part of society that will influence how you grow up. So if we want people to be able to have free thought the most, then I think brutalist architecture is the best for that. Again, it has been done wrong, but the ways that it's been done wrong isn't inherent to brutalism. That's not what brutalism in its purest form is. And I also don't think that that's what people think of when they see modern Western brutalist structures, because let's be honest, most people don't really know that much about what buildings in the Soviet Union were like. Most people aren't that nerdy, but even when they do, there's still some unconscious bias that they have towards the West and towards these Western brutalist structures, because it is the West, because they were done properly, that they don't have these oppressive thoughts coming into their mind when seeing it, because it's done properly in the West. I mean, it's still done improperly in the West sometimes, but all architectural styles are done improperly sometimes. Old architectural styles can be done improperly, new ones can be done improperly, and they can both be done properly. It's just brutalism it's unfortunate because it had a specific government that had a specific ideology that didn't necessarily comport with brutalism, used it, and that tainted those brutalist structures. But there's two things. One, that's not what brutalism itself is, and two, I don't even think that's what people think of when they see modern Western brutalist structures. That's just, again, this is an Eastern thing.
There are more bad-madely brutalist buildings than good ones, and the public would see those brutalist buildings much more. And there may be biases towards seeing and understanding that some brutalist buildings are better than others and pivot to certain things. But as we can see from the salutogenic theory, that no matter how well we can interpret certain brutalist buildings, it's the current environment that they live in which can invoke a lower degree of living. So with most brutalist buildings in the Western area, most of them are just like, they come from the 1970s, it's been like 20 years since they've been made, it hasn't been maintained, it's been degraded, and people see those buildings most of the time, especially since they're most common in more urban areas, and that's the impression they get from brutalism. Because
another thing I want to clarify, a building being made of concrete doesn't make it brutalist. So a lot of the buildings that you might be talking about and that people might think of aren't actually what I'm referring to when I say brutalism. So like random apartment blocks that we often think of, those aren't necessarily brutalist. Brutalism is a specific form. Yeah, go on.
But I find that's the biggest issue, that brutalism, it's so hard to create. A lot of people mess it up, a lot of people misinterpret the idea itself. And because of that, we have a very ambiguous view of what we see brutalism is. And a lot of people associate these ideas that they just don't understand to brutalism. Because of that, it comes to the point where the style itself has become so influential because we just do not understand it enough. It has been widespread everywhere throughout, like the continents, Asia, all those types of places. But there is just not a lot of people who would like it because there is not a clear understanding of what it is. We see concrete, and then we assume that that's brutalism. No one knows the details. And we see that every single structure which is kind of related to criteria of the assumptions of what we believe brutalism is, we associate that idea of the true form, we can say, of brutalism. No matter how simplistic, no matter how simple it is still an ideal. And even if in the most pure state of what brutalism can be, it's an aesthetic purpose, right, at the end of the day, but it's a style which can be so warped to the point where we see it as bad or immoral. Probably immoral.
Sure, but again, you're missing the context. We don't view that with other, especially older architecture styles, because they weren't made under the same system that just so happened to make most old brutalist structures that exist now. So we sometimes view brutalism, like when we hear the word brutalism, not when we see actual brutalist structures in the West, because most people see the structures, they don't think of this, because most people don't really think about brutalism either way. But we sometimes have this negative connotation with the word because of the context by which it was built in the last century. With the context which didn't exist for other architectural styles, so we don't impose that on other architectural styles. If, for example, the Soviet Union or another government like that used a more classical architectural style that's existed for a while and used that and done that poorly, we may view, or I think we would view, that architectural style in the same way that we view the word brutalism now. I'm saying the word brutalism because when people see brutalist structures, they don't really think this, especially ones in the West. They think that the word, because the word brutalism invokes these images of degrading, oppressive Soviet apartment blocks. But that's just not what brutalism is. That's just cheap governments. Again, they could do the same thing, but with a classical type of architecture. Maybe it's brick or stone or some type of church, and make it look bad, which there are many. There are many churches, especially Protestant ones, that just look ugly. But we don't think of church architecture as inherently ugly because it wasn't as widespread, because there wasn't a government that happened to be making all these ugly churches everywhere. So I think it's an unfortunate state of events that this happened to happen with this architectural style. But still, for the arguments that I gave earlier, I think it is the best architectural style to have as a default for society if we do it properly, which we are doing in the recent years in the West.
I do agree. It's not just context, but the overall impression that the public makes when they see brutalist buildings is these old, dilapidated buildings from the 1970s, and that's the impression that they get. And throughout history, there will be many more iterations of brutalism, which will improve and make it more substantial and make it more interesting to all these people. And it won't just be us debating something that most people don't understand. But the overall impression right now and the history surrounding it, because even though history is not a grand part of art itself, we can see from like many examples, like the Mona Lisa.
Okay, well, in conclusion, to summarize, I think brutalism is not only not an immoral form of architecture, I think it's the best form of architecture to use as a default for society. Going over my points, for one, it is the most unbiased form of architecture, and therefore it is the most advantageous when trying to go forth with a society which values tabula rasa and a blank slate, which are both the same thing, and freedom of thought, because they aren't as influenced by the subliminal ideological messages that are often in architecture, because of course architecture is inherently ideological. Even brutalism is, but it's just less so, and it's ideological in a different way that isn't as in your face. I think that, especially in modern times and in the West, brutalist structures are very sturdy, despite popular misconception, specifically because of some brutalist apartment blocks in the Western Union and other Warsaw Pact countries. Modern and Western brutalist structures are very sturdy, actually. There's very little water damage that happens. They last for a very long time. They aren't renovated as much because they don't need to be renovated, because they're just that sturdy. I think brutalism is very aesthetic as well, just irrespective of the ideological stuff and the material, sturdy stuff. Irrespective of all that, brutalism is very aesthetically pleasing, when done properly especially. Its proportions is good. It is symmetrical, but it's also unsymmetrical in a good way, as all types of architecture are, but it's unique in brutalism. And in brutalism, since it's just made out of raw concrete, there's more capacity for diversity of form in the building itself. Older buildings, they had more ornamentation, but they were more constricted in form. They could only really build a few iterations of the same form, with maybe different ornaments. But brutalism is much easier to make form. Types of forms you can use more fluid, etc. Brutalism also, I think, has a lot of misconceptions about it because of two main reasons. The first main reason is that a lot of brutalism in the 20th century was done in Eastern countries like the Soviet Union, which were very cheap in how they built it. This wasn't inherent to brutalism. That's just how the government made buildings because they were cheap. So a lot of people, when they hear the word brutalism, they associate those connotations with it. But when they see actual Western modern brutalist structures, they don't think that because they see it as different because it is a different thing, even though they're both brutalist. And also, I think some people sometimes view it as not that beautiful because it's sometimes out of place. Because the cities we live in now are much older than when we started using brutalism. So if there's just classical architecture everywhere, these brick corner stores, that type of architecture, then just a brutalist block in the middle, it'll look displeasing. But if the entire city is truly brutalist, people will find it aesthetically pleasing. People do find brutalist structures aesthetically pleasing.
I find brutalist buildings to be immoral because even with water damage not as a prevalent issue nowadays, temperature damage can still occur, especially with some extreme temperatures like in winter and in the summer. A lot of people in this modern days associate Soviet Union with brutalism, and Soviet Union is inherently immoral. So people tie that a lot to the values which brutalism hold, and they see brutalism as immoral. A lot of people associate that, and because of that association, people live a generally lower quality of life because the stresses of their environment can affect their mental health, and the harm of human beings is what I consider immoral. History is still important, context still matters, because especially with, even though, because the style itself, history can only affect the style that it's being characterized from if the history is directly related to the style itself. Because we can see that with brutalism, it came to Soviet Union because of the values that brutalism imparted onto the Soviet Union. That is cost effective, that it was able to exude the power and political confidence that they need, especially right after World War II when they were more weak than ever before. It is not history which created brutalism, but brutalism allowed its history to be looked at in a certain way.